He slept under bridges while others slept in beds. 17-year-old Marcus Johnson had learned that seconds decide everything. When the black smoke rose over Interstate 40 near Detroit, cars slowed down, people pulled out phones, but nobody dared get closer. Nobody except a thin boy in torn sneakers who didn't hesitate. They never saw him coming, but he was always there. The smell of burning rubber and gasoline hit Marcus before he saw the flames. Traffic had slowed to a crawl on the overpass, drivers craning their necks to see the wreckage below. A silver sedan had flipped over the guardrail, its front end crumpled against a concrete pillar, black smoke pouring from the engine. Marcus dropped the cardboard sign he'd been holding and ran down the embankment, his worn sneakers sliding on the loose gravel. The car's passenger door was jammed shut, the frame twisted from the impact. Through the spider-webbed windshield, Marcus could see a man slumped over the steering wheel, unconscious, blood trickling from his forehead. The acrid smell of burning oil made his eyes water, but he kept pulling at the door handle until his knuckles were raw. The metal groaned and finally gave way. The unconscious man was heavy, dead weight in the expensive suit that now had glass fragments scattered across the shoulders. Marcus grabbed him under the arms and dragged him away from the car just as the flames spread to the interior. He laid the man on the grass 20 feet from the wreck, checking for a pulse the way he'd learned from a paramedic who sometimes gave him food behind the hospital. By the time the fire department arrived, a small crowd had gathered on the overpass above, pointing and taking pictures. The man had regained consciousness, sitting up slowly and pressing a hand to his bleeding head. He looked around confused until his eyes found Marcus, who was quietly brushing glass off the man's jacket. "You," the man's voice was hoarse from smoke. "You pulled me out." Marcus nodded but didn't speak. He'd learned long ago that talking to strangers often led to questions he couldn't answer, about where he lived, where his parents were, why he wasn't in school. The paramedics were approaching now, and Marcus started to back away toward the shadows under the overpass. "Wait!" the man called out, struggling to stand. "What's your name?" But Marcus was already disappearing into the maze of concrete pillars and abandoned shopping carts where he'd made his temporary home. He moved quickly through the familiar darkness, past the other invisible people who lived in the city's forgotten spaces. By the time the news vans arrived, he was already gone. The man they'd taken to Detroit General Hospital was Richard Hawthorne, owner of Hawthorne Construction, one of the largest building companies in the state. As the doctors stitched up the gash on his forehead, all he could think about were the boy's eyes. Old eyes in a young face, eyes that had seen too much but still chose to act when others stood by and watched. The next morning, Richard returned to the crash site. The burned-out shell of his sedan had been towed away, but he walked the area methodically, looking for some trace of his rescuer. He found nothing but tire tracks and broken glass. At the gas station across the street, he showed the clerk a description of the boy. Nothing. At the fast food restaurant next door, the same result. It was as if the kid had materialized from thin air. Richard spent the following days driving through the rougher parts of the city, checking homeless shelters and soup kitchens. Most people he talked to just shrugged or looked away when he described the thin black teenager who'd saved his life. But at St. Mary's Community Center, an older woman named Dorothy paused when he mentioned the boy's quick movements and quiet manner. "Might be Marcus," she said, ladling soup into paper bowls. "Haven't seen him in a week or so, but he used to come by for dinner sometimes. Real polite kid. Never caused trouble, never asked for anything extra." Dorothy gave him directions to an abandoned warehouse district where some of the street kids were known to sleep. Richard drove there at sunset, his Mercedes looking out of place among the broken streetlights and graffitied walls. He walked carefully through the shadows, calling out softly. He found Marcus in a makeshift shelter built from corrugated metal and tarps, tucked between two concrete loading docks. The boy was sharing a can of cold soup with an elderly homeless man, both of them huddled around a small battery-powered radio. When Marcus saw Richard approaching, he tensed, ready to run. "It's okay," Richard said, holding up his hands. "I just wanted to thank you, and to ask your name." Marcus studied him warily. The suit was different, but still expensive. The bandage on his forehead was smaller now. "Marcus," he said finally. "Marcus." Richard sat down on a broken cinder block, uninvited. "You saved my life, Marcus. I've been looking for you for 3 days." "You shouldn't be here," Marcus said quietly. "This isn't a safe place for people like you." The old man beside Marcus chuckled dryly. "Kids got more sense than most adults." Richard looked around at the makeshift camp, at the sleeping bags arranged between shopping carts, at the faces peering out from cardboard shelters. "How long have you been living like this?" Marcus shrugged. "Since I was 14, maybe 15. Hard to keep track." "Where are your parents?" "Dead." Marcus's voice was matter-of-fact, without self-pity. "Car accident when I was 12. Bounced around foster homes for a while. Ran away when I was 13. Richard felt something tighten in his chest. "Listen, Marcus, I want to help you. I've got a construction business. I could use someone." "I don't need charity," Marcus interrupted, his voice sharp. "It's not charity. It's a job. You proved something to me on that highway. You didn't hesitate when everyone else did. That's worth something." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, watching Richard's face in the dim light. "What kind of job?" "Start at the bottom. Learn the trade. If you stick with it, there's room to grow. I'll help you get your GED, maybe even college later if you want it." The old man elbowed Marcus gently. "Sounds like a good deal, son." Marcus looked around at his makeshift home, at the other faces watching from the shadows. "What's the catch?" "No catch. Just show up every day and work hard. That's all I ask." 3 days later, Marcus reported to Hawthorne Construction's main office on Jefferson Avenue. Richard had arranged for him to stay in a small apartment above the tool shop, nothing fancy but clean and warm. The other workers looked him up and down skeptically, a skinny black kid in second-hand clothes who spoke softly and kept to himself. The foreman, a red-faced man named Sullivan, wasn't shy about his doubts. "Hope you don't expect special treatment because you're the boss's pet project," he said, handing Marcus a hard hat that was too big for his head. Marcus said nothing, just nodded and picked up the wheelbarrow he'd been assigned to push. By noon, he'd moved more concrete than workers twice his size, never stopping to rest or complain. By the end of the week, even Sullivan grudgingly admitted the kid had stamina. Richard watched from his office window as Marcus worked, remembering the moment when those young hands had pulled him from burning metal. There was something in the way the boy moved, a quiet determination that reminded Richard of his own father, who'd built this company with nothing but sweat and stubbornness. At the end of Marcus's first month, one of the crew leaders approached Richard with a complaint. "The kid's making the rest of us look bad," he said. "Shows up early, stays late, never takes breaks. It's setting a bad precedent." Richard smiled grimly. Maybe the precedent needed setting. Marcus had found his rhythm in the construction world. He absorbed everything: how to read blueprints, how to operate machinery, how to spot structural problems before they became disasters. During lunch breaks, while others played cards or complained about their wives, Marcus studied technical manuals that Richard had given him. The breakthrough came 6 months later on a project downtown where they were renovating an old theater. Marcus was moving supplies when he noticed something wrong with the foundation work. He studied it for several minutes, then approached the site engineer, a college graduate with 20 years of experience. "Excuse me," Marcus said quietly. "I think there might be a problem with the rebar spacing." The engineer barely looked up from his clipboard. "Kid, I've been doing this since before you were born." But Marcus persisted, explaining what he'd observed, showing the measurements he'd taken. The engineer finally listened, checked his own calculations, and discovered Marcus was right. The error, if uncorrected, could have caused the entire structure to fail within 5 years. Word of Marcus's catch spread through the company. Richard wasn't surprised. He'd seen that same careful attention to detail the day Marcus had pulled him from the burning car, checking his pulse and clearing glass from his jacket while sirens wailed in the distance. The other workers' attitudes began to shift. They started asking Marcus's opinion on problems, including him in their conversations. Sullivan, the skeptical foreman, began assigning him more complex tasks. The kid who'd been sleeping under bridges was becoming one of their most trusted hands. One evening, as they were closing up the job site, Richard found Marcus sitting alone on a stack of lumber, looking at the city skyline. The sun was setting behind the buildings, casting long shadows across the construction zone. "Regret leaving the streets?" Richard asked, settling down beside him. Marcus considered this seriously. "Sometimes I miss the freedom, but I don't miss the hunger or the cold. You know, you could go to college now. I'd help with the tuition. You've got the aptitude for engineering, maybe architecture." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "I've been thinking about that, but I also like building things, seeing something grow from nothing." Richard nodded. "There's more than one way to make a difference in the world." 2 years later, Marcus had his GED and was taking night classes in structural engineering while working days as a project supervisor. He'd moved into a real apartment, bought his first car, started dating a teacher he'd met at the community college, but he never forgot where he came from. Every Saturday morning, Marcus returned to St. Mary's Community Center, not for a meal this time, but to help serve them. Dorothy, now in her 70s, smiled every time she saw him ladling soup into the same paper bowls he'd once eaten from. "Look at you," she'd say, pride evident in her voice, "from both sides of the serving line." One Saturday, a thin teenager in torn sneakers approached the food table. Something about his eyes reminded Marcus of his own reflection in storefront windows during those years on the street. When the boy hesitated at the entrance, looking like he might bolt, Marcus walked over and held the door open. "It's okay," Marcus said quietly. "They don't ask questions here." The boy nodded and stepped inside, and Marcus remembered another voice saying almost the same words to him years ago in the shadows under an overpass. Sometimes salvation comes in small gestures, in the willingness to see dignity where others see only problems. At the construction site on Monday, Richard watched Marcus train a new apprentice, a young woman fresh out of trade school. Marcus was patient with her mistakes, encouraging her questions, showing her the same respect he'd once craved himself. The company was growing, taking on bigger projects, and Marcus had become Richard's most trusted supervisor. During their weekly meeting, Richard spread blueprints across his desk for their next project, a community center in the same neighborhood where Marcus had once lived on the streets. "Think you're ready to manage this one solo?" Richard asked. Marcus studied the plans, seeing not just structural elements, but the lives that would be changed by what they built. "I think so," he said. Richard folded the blueprints and handed them to Marcus. Then it's yours." As Marcus left the office, Richard watched him walk across the construction yard, greeting workers by name, stopping to check on progress, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged exactly where he was. It had been 3 years since that afternoon on Interstate 40, 3 years since a homeless teenager had chosen to run toward danger instead of away from it. The silver sedan was long gone, replaced by insurance money and forgotten by everyone except the two people whose lives had intersected in those crucial seconds. Richard kept a photo on his desk from that day, a newspaper shot of the burning car with a figure in torn sneakers pulling someone to safety. The caption read, "Unidentified Good Samaritan saves driver." But Richard knew the identification now. He knew that sometimes the people we overlook are exactly the ones we need to see. Marcus never talked about that day, but sometimes, when he passed the spot where it happened, he remembered the weight of an unconscious man in his arms and the decision to act when others stood frozen. He thought about the chain of moments that connected who he'd been to who he'd become, not just the dramatic rescue, but all the small choices since then. To stay instead of run, to build instead of just survive, to help others climb the same ladder he'd found. On the wall of his apartment, Marcus kept his own photo from that day, though from a different angle, one that showed his face as he knelt beside the injured man, young and scared but determined. Below it, he'd written a single line. "Sometimes you save someone else's life and end up finding your own." Years later, when people asked Richard about his most successful investment, he never mentioned stock portfolios or real estate deals. Instead, he talked about a 17-year-old boy who'd refused to walk past a burning car, who'd chosen courage when the world had given him every reason to choose cynicism. The return on that investment couldn't be measured in dollars, only in the lives Marcus touched, the buildings he constructed, the example he set for others who thought they were invisible. The community center rose from concrete and steel that summer, Marcus supervising every detail. On opening day, Dorothy from St. Mary's cut the ribbon, her weathered hands steady as she snipped through the red satin. Marcus stood in the back of the crowd, watching children run through the doors of something he'd helped create. Richard found him there as the crowd dispersed. "Proud of what you built?" he asked. Marcus looked at the building, then at the people streaming inside. Families from the neighborhood where he'd once hidden in the shadows, kids who might never have to learn what it felt like to be invisible. "We," he said quietly. "What we built." And in that correction, Richard heard the echo of his own voice from years before, offering not charity, but partnership, not pity, but opportunity. Sometimes salvation is a two-way street, and the person you save might end up saving you right back. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stop and see dignity where others see only desperation, to offer a hand up instead of a handout, to believe that the person everyone overlooks might be exactly who the world needs to notice. He never forgot the feeling of running toward fire when everyone else ran away.